I am Joong-Gwon Kim from Hanmaum Church in Chincheon. I used to think that money and fame were everything in life, and I achieved these things, but was never satisfied. But after I met Jesus, I found true satisfaction. I would like to share with you how this happened. I would think that most people desire success and wealth in life, but my obsession about these things was particularly strong. Money and fame were my idols, and they completely ruled my whole life. I think this was because my family's financial difficulties during my youth greatly affected me. After college, I was hired by one of the leading conglomerates in Korea, and to succeed, I only focused on work. To succeed faster than others and to be promoted faster than others, I had to work harder than others. Work was always my priority. That meant that my family life was always pushed aside. And now that I think back at the time, I was determined to turn my back on God. That's because I thought that God was needed only for aimless and incompetent people, and that it was a luxury for someone fighting his way through life to have faith. They say you can't do two things at once. While I lived like this, my family life was a complete mess. You see, I fell in love with my wife at first sight. So I chased her tenaciously for almost 13 years until we finally got married. But after we got married, I hardly ever took a day off from work. And there were many days when I came home after 2 a.m. My wife used to complain often. "Why didn't you just marry your work instead of me?" We also got into a lot of arguments about this. But I always felt thankful for my wife for marrying into my poor household, and I always felt bad towards her. So I promised her many times that I would change and that I would come home early and be a good family man. But keeping these promises was impossible. Eventually, my wife began to become dependent on alcohol. And when I came home, the house was full of bottles. Then one day, my wife must have thought she had enough. She brought home divorce files from the courthouse. She gave me the papers and demanded a divorce. But I told her this was complete nonsense. I would never divorce her, and tore up the papers. Looking back, I think that must have been the most difficult time that my wife had ever had in her life. And very ironically, due to such circumstances, my wife came to meet Jesus at Hanmaum Church in Chincheon. Meanwhile, I studied abroad in the U.S. in 1993 and got back to Korea in 1995 to begin working again. When I was a student abroad, I spent a lot of time with my family for the first time. But when I began working again, my enthusiasm for work increased even more. I worked really hard. As a result, I was promoted at a super high speed. I became the youngest general manager in the company's history. My promotion was so fast that I was team leader of my colleagues who had been hired at the same time as me, and one person who was my senior by 4 years. I also found out later that I was an HPI of the company. HPI stands for High Performance Individual. It was a CEO development program that nurtures future leaders of the company. Just the fact that I was selected for the program meant that my success was guaranteed in the company, but my greed was endless. When I thought about it, no matter how much I succeeded in the company, I would only remain as an employee. I wondered, could I be satisfied with an employee's salary for the rest of my life? Of course I couldn't. I decided to start my own company. My employer refused my resignation letter many times, but regardless, I started my own company in 1999 with my experience and expertise. At the time, all I had were my house, severance pay, and my company stock. I kept the down payment on my house and sold everything else to invest in my business. Of course, I left some living expenses because I couldn't bring home earnings at the time. Just as everyone else with a startup company does, I had a very difficult first 2 years. Most people who had promised to help once I left to start my own company turned their backs on me when a crucial moment came. It was a period in which I got to learn what kind of world this was. It was also a time in which Hanmaum church members prayed the most for me and my company. Truly by God's grace, as the time went on, my company's circumstances improved, and through M&A, it grew as a major company in the industry with dealings of $100 million. I was the largest shareholder at the time, and I made a lot of money. I also became a CEO of an ad agency. Working in the ad industry all these years, I had produced hundreds of commercials and had managed the ads of various products. I think it was sometime in the mid-90s. The Korean market had finally opened up for imported Japanese home appliances. This kind of generalization is gone now, but at the time, consumers thought that Japanese products were superior. So there was an ad series I designed for Korean products to compete against Japanese ones, such as Kimchi Refrigerator series and the Mop with the Vacuum series. I also made a beer commercial. Do you remember the Men's Choice Koss series? Min So Choi and Hae Sung Kim were in them. And I wondered if you remembered all those commercials for apartment complexes. Do you remember Young A. Lee on a Trendbill? That was for the Zai apartment complex. I managed this ad campaign from its start for several years. So as the company got merged and grew bigger, I got the strong desire to make it an even better company. Of course, as much as I poured my time and effort into my company, I strayed far away from my family life. Usually, most wives are afraid that their husbands would get laid off from work, but my wife insisted that I should quit my job. She would insist it every morning as I was leaving for work. That was her greeting for the day. But I was basically addicted to my company. And you see, my daily pattern was always predictable. One night, as usual, I came home very drunk after entertaining a group of visitors to the company. I collapsed on the bed without washing up, and my wife shook me, telling me to climb down from the bed and wash up before I slept. And unconsciously, I murmured, "What are you talking about? Do you know what it took for me to get to where I am? I'm not getting down from my place." My wife later told me what I had said to her in my sleep. I used to tell my wife all the time that I was working hard and enduring all the stress and labor for her and the family. But honestly, I can tell you that it was really for my own desire and greed. I wanted so much to make money and to have fame. And finally, I had achieved success that made many people envious. Of course, it's all relative. But now I had money and fame. But my greed couldn't be satisfied with that. Like Jesus said, the water that this world gives is like salt water. It makes you thirstier as you drink. The more you get, the more you want. That was how the world was. Just like the Samaritan woman at the well, there was nothing that could satisfy me in this world. Overworking, fatigue, stress, entertaining business guests at the bar and at the golf course. At the time, what I needed most was sleep. But this lifestyle did not allow for much of that. On the outside, to people's eyes, I looked completely fine. But actually, my health was at its worst, and my mental state followed. It began to deteriorate a lot. You know, people say that God works in His time. And really, finally, God answered my wife's prayer. When my mind and body hit rock bottom, even money didn't matter anymore. And I thought that if I continued down this path, I could even end up dead. When I actually went for a checkup at the doctor's, the results really were at their worst. So I very unexpectedly wrote my resignation letter for the company. At the time, my son was leaving for the U.S. to study, and I followed my son and wife to America without any sort of plan or thought. I got to think about many things in America. My life had always been about looking ahead and running forward. But for the first time in my life, I could stop and look back on my life. Has my life been spent meaningfully up to this point? And I must go on living, but do I have something worthwhile to keep living for? As I seriously thought about these questions, I realized that I had not accomplished anything worthwhile. What made me feel even more miserable was that there was nothing worthwhile to keep living for. The endless toil was meaningless. It was then that I could really see that from the depths of my heart. My wife was a devoted Christian and was meeting many thirsty souls in the States at the time. I also got to have worship service with the people we met in the States. That was when God worked in me strongly. God's presence was so strong at the first Sunday worship I attended in the United States. I was so moved as I watched the church members in the States. They loved worship and the Word of God so much that during the worship service, I grew ashamed of myself. As I saw how they were in tears, as they worshiped and shared the grace of God, I saw how, compared to myself, they were such precious people. Not only did they have great assurance in Jesus, but were walking with Him every single day. But what about me? I have been chasing after empty things and wasting my whole life. During the entire worship, God showed me clearly how I was standing before the world and how those people were standing before God. All my life, I had loved this world so much that I had completely betrayed God in my heart. I had entirely become my own Lord and had lived however I wanted. That was how I lived my life. Think about how many sins I must have committed as a result. Through the solid proof of the resurrection, God made it known to me exactly and certainly that Jesus who came to earth was God, and that He was my Lord. Despite this, I still hadn't believed in Jesus, and had committed adultery with the world, and had lived as a slave to the devil, beating my breast. I repented such a life before God, and I accepted Jesus as my Lord. Amen. After I accepted Jesus as my Lord, this verse caught my eyes from Ecclesiastes, which Solomon wrote. I have seen all things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. You see, these words weren't spoken by some regular old man at the end of his days. This was the confession of a king of Israel who had enjoyed all conceivable wealth and glory of this world. Reading this confession of King Solomon, that he had seen and done everything in this world, but that it was all meaningless, my heart automatically said, Amen. That's because I felt exactly the same. I think now I've come to realize Solomon's heart. No, God's heart. I used to think that a man's life as he grows old was all in vain. But it was not so. A life of not believing in Jesus was in vain. And what's surprising is that the more you know Jesus, the more clearly you see the world. It says that this world is in darkness. So it got clear to me how I should live in this world from now on. I left the advertising industry and now live as the CEO of a mid-sized firm. In the past, I used to live for my own greed, but now my life has changed. I am now a person who lives for the Lord Jesus' calling. Amen. Whenever I get a chance, I call an employee up to my office, and I share with him the gospel. This is because my company is the mission field God gave me. Now I am happy. It is not because of money or fame. I am truly happy because of Jesus.
Amen.
I can assure you, the most successful person in this world is someone who believes in Jesus as his Lord.
Amen.
There is everything in Jesus: peace, joy, and satisfaction that the world can never give you.
Amen.
These days, I live enjoying all of these things. These are what I couldn't taste before when I lived according to my greed.
Amen.
This peace, joy, and happiness were things that could never be bought with money or fame. They were things that resulted only when you have faith in Jesus as Lord.
Amen.
Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and your years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. This is my last word. It's a plea to all of you who work hard to run after your own dreams in this world, not knowing Jesus. Please accept Jesus, the Creator of these heavens and this earth, as the Lord of your life in your heart. I now conclude my testimony. Thank you.